Okay, I'd like to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Mr. Steve Bonowski. He's a longtime collector of Portuguese and Portuguese colony stamps. So please welcome Mr. Bonowski.
Thank you, Gary. And I, in turn, would like to invite everyone to this showing of Portuguese East Africa and its myriad of stamp issuing entities from 1870 to 1940, as produced and compiled by Dr. John K. Cross from Oakhurst, California. I've known John for many years, corresponded with him for many years through the International Society for Portuguese Philately, and he generously offered his PowerPoint of this presentation to the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library for us to produce a YouTube video on his behalf and also for the library. As an introduction, let's go into our very first slides. Okay, what we're going to do here is show several slides of stamps that show early exploration. With the capture of Constantinople and the end of the Eastern Roman Empire in 1453, trade routes to the east from the Mediterranean were blocked by the Ottoman Turks. And so Portugal, being right on the ocean, immediately began to explore out into the ocean and going south along the coastline of Africa, looking for routes to get to the Far East, at least what for them was the Far East. And so let's show a few more slides as we go along. Bartolomé Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope and Cape Agulhas, which is actually the southernmost point of Africa, in 1486, went a little ways up the east coast and then returned to Lisbon. And finally, in 1497 to 1498, Vasco da Gama made his trip hugging along the coast of Africa. He didn't get out in the middle of the South Atlantic, as this stamp shows, and then went up the east coast of Africa and ended up at the city of Calicut in India in 1498, thus establishing the trade route for Portugal that bypassed the Ottoman Empire and the Mediterranean to get to India. This is an interesting stamp, the world's very first Christmas stamp that was issued by Canada. And some people specialize in collecting these stamps because all the red markings, you never know where they're going to end up. And as you can see here, raising a question, really, was Mozambique British? Not quite, but that's what this stamp, this particular variety of the stamp seems to show. Now here we have a map of Mozambique as it largely looks today, but also as it looked 200 to 300 years ago. The Portuguese were primarily along the coast, and for unknown reason, probably because several provinces were under concession with private companies, concessions that were issued by the Portuguese government, most of the provinces issued their own stamps. At the top, you see what was then very thinly populated provinces of Niassa and Cabo Delgado that were awarded a concession for the Niassa Company, which was primarily a British company. In the middle of the country, you see the provinces of Manica and Sofala around the mouth of the Zambezi River, which were awarded as a concession to another company, the Mozambique Company. And there was even a third one, the Zambezia Company, that did shipping along the Zambezi River from the coast into the inland. In Mozambique, there were several primary themes that were followed, and we show a few of them here. Starting in the upper left, the crown issues King Luis, two separate designs of King Carlos, King Manuel, who was only on the throne for 2 years until he was overthrown in the bloodless revolution of 1910 that removed the monarchy. That created a shortage of stamps, and so many stamps were overprinted Republica And then finally, order was restored beginning in 1913-14 with the Goddess Ceres issue that was issued for all Portuguese territories and a different design showing the same goddess for Portugal itself. Here we have an interesting trio. These are from the crown issues that were the Portuguese crown that were issued between the early 1870s and the mid 1880s. But here for Mozambique itself, these stamps of Mozambique, as well as all other colonies, were forged by the prolific forger Francois Fournier. And the only stamp of these three that is genuine is the one in the middle. And there are several telltales that one can determine forgeries from genuine. The easiest one is to look at the center stamp and you see the 4 florets or flower arrangements in the corners. They do not touch the inside line of those corners, whereas on forgeries, the florets will touch one or more of the inside corners. Other common themes, in addition to the designs that we've already shown, were done for airmail stamps, postage dues, war tax, and charity stamps, and here, fiscals and revenues. And these are important because some of the issues of the revenue stamp on the left were overprinted for postage use. And here's an example of postal stationery, early postal stationery. And what you see is that these stamps were interchangeable. Here's a postcard that also has an upgrade in postage since it's going to the US by a stamp from the Zambezia province. The anniversary of St. Anthony was celebrated in various of the colonies as well as Portugal itself. Here we show in Hambane, and these were also issued overprinted stamps for Mozambique itself, values good through the entire country, and also for Lorenzo Marque, which was the capital. Interestingly enough, these have also been forged. A common theme in the Portuguese Empire is that particularly in the colonies, if a stamp's been surcharged with a different value or overprinted for a special purpose, chances are pretty good in the classic period through 1940 that you will have forgeries. And the forgeries on these are determined by the distance between the lines of the overprint. The Carlos Mouchon stamp is named for the designer Mouchon, whose name is in a very small print at the bottom of each stamp. This was the workhorse issue, not only in Portugal, but also in all of the colonies. These were issued 1898 to 1903. But in some of the colonies, they continued to be in use with Republica overprints into the 1920s. And they came in sheetlets of 28. Now, here you have some varieties. On the left, 2 stamps of King Carlos from Inhambane, and look at the difference in the letter M in the top line. And then on the right, you have the upper stamp, which spells Marque, M-A-R-Q-U-E-S, actually F-S, and then the one on the bottom is the correct one, M-A-R-Q-U-E-S. And these printing varieties can be hard to find, but most of them are fairly inexpensive and they're good additions to your collection. After the monarchy was overthrown in 1910, postmasters, particularly in the colonies, they grabbed for everything they could get their hands on. Old stamp issues going back as far as even King Louis in the 1880s. They used up old stocks and overprinted them with Republica. And here you have some surcharges also, and then all sorts of interesting things happening like inverted overprints, inverted surcharges. Some of these were produced for the philatelic trade. Some of them are forgeries. It's good to have some reference material on forgeries of Portugal and colonies in order to work these out on your own. 1913 for Macau and 1914 for all the other colonies, postal order was restored with the issues of the goddess Ceres issue for all the colonies, and also for Portugal with a different design. And those Portuguese Ceres were also overprinted Azores for use in the Azores. And these are proofs of the issues. This particular stamp issue was in existence for a long time. Stamps were issued into the early 1930s in various varieties, overprints. Printing these stamps required 2 passes through the printing press. One to generate the basic stamp in its color. The second pass added the name of the country and the denomination. And there are over 300 different printing plate flaws identified on these stamps, as well as errors from the second pass-through. One of the most prominent flaws is the one that's showing here that occurred only on issues of the African colonies, a crack or fenda in the plate frame above the E of Portuguese on top. The higher values of these, and actually we should say that this particular error was found in one location position number 70 on the sheets of 100. Some of them are very rare in that the highest values in each of the African colonies had 12,500 produced, or 125 sheets of 100. So at the most, for those highest values, you could have 125 different copies of this particular error. With the passage of time and the delay it took in recognizing these, an educated guess says that maybe no more than 50 or 60 of these errors still exist, and which makes it more rare than the famous inverted Jenny, the U.S. airmailed, of 100. And that catalogs for $100,000. These even more scarce errors of the African colonies of Portugal cataloged for a couple bucks. It's all in demand. On the right, you have another example of a plate crack, a little bit smaller. It's above the G of Portuguese. And again, there are over 300 different plate flaws and cracks and various deformities that have been identified on the underlying stamps. On the stamps at the bottom, these are printing plate flaws, or printing flaws, not plate. Here you see a cut in the C for centavo. And then on the right, the infamous broken M, first M in Mozambique, that makes it look like Zocambique. Zocambique issues errors are not listed in the U.S. Scott catalog, but they are listed in the Portuguese Mundafil catalog for the former colonies. For countries that had shorter names, 4 or 5 letters, stars were added at the ends of the slug, supposedly for stability. What's interesting, though, is that there are 4 different positions of each star. And so positions 1, 2, 3, and 4, meaning that the stars rotate. And there are people who try to collect all of these if possible. And they come 1, 1, 1, 4, 2, 2, etc. It's another part of what makes collection of these series stamps in the colonies very intriguing and interesting. We'll have a short break here, and we go back to the early 1900s when there was a major currency reevaluation for all the colonies. These are just for Mozambique, Zambezia, Lorenzo Mark, and one of the other territories, no Inhambane. These were issued for all colonies. Some of them are rather scarce, and because it's a surcharge of a new value, sometimes a surcharge will be over on the left, over on the right, at the top. And so again, something that's fascinating about collecting classic stamps from the Portuguese colonies. Back to the series issues again, new definitive sets were coming for all the major colonies in the early 1930s. By this time, the subgroups provinces of Mozambique no longer issued their own stamps, and the Nyasa company had lost its charter. So, but with new stamps coming out and existing stocks, it became important to thrifty postmasters. We got to use them up, and for whatever purpose we can. There are surcharges here. On the lower right, a Lorenzo Marx stamp was overprinted and surcharged for use in all of Mozambique. Portillado stands for postage due. Now, speaking of the Nyasa company, we'll take a quick run through. Remember, this company had its concession in far northern Mozambique in the provinces of Nyasa and Cabo Delgado. In 1894, the company issued unauthorized stamps these are called the rooks because they have a chess piece on them. Most of these ended up being destroyed because they were unauthorized. The Portuguese government told them they had to get rid of them. But these can still be found. They're not super expensive, and they will add to your collection of Nyasa. And Cabo Delgado is the name of one of the provinces, and it's also the name of a cape jutting out into the Indian Ocean in northern Mozambique. Here's some additional forerunners or rooks. Sometimes one can find actual sheets or sheetlets of these. When they were saved by collectors, sometimes they were glued down rather than using old style hinges. So make sure to be very careful if you come across some of these. With the official issues, the Nyasa overprint was added to issues of Mozambique. And a piece of postal stationery for the Mozambique company, for Nyasa, and it's separated with a stamp. Then finally, King Carlos and the short reign of King Manuel were used and issued for the Nyasa company. The stamp on the left is from a set of 13 King Carlos stamps, and these are known for having the center, the animal, inverted. Reprints were made of the original couple of sheets, but there are no more than 2,500 possible complete sets. And those do catalog considerably more in the Scott catalog than do the underlying correctly printed stamps of King Carlos. There were also additional overprints and surcharges. Some of these were heavily forged. It's a good chance that the three on top that are inverted are probably forgeries. And also some surcharges of additional values were done on King Manuel stamps. For the Mozambique company, they started out the same way, overprinting regular issues. And again, you're dealing with overprints, and you can see the two on the bottom. Something happened here. Got a double overprint, and then you got one that was sunk toward the bottom. And these are all eminently collectible. The stamp on the lower right also has some misapplication, missing color, and which makes it another collectible variety. The Mozambique company also issued elephant stamps. They started issuing those, I believe, in the 1890s and continued for about 20 years. Again, they came in sheetlets of 28. There are all sorts of varieties in the designs of these stamps called cliches that were the subject of a book published in 2022 by Dr. Cross. And here are some up close views, and you can see shade differences. Some people would consider these just one stamp. I consider them two stamps, varieties of each. The colors are a little different, and for me, that makes them different stamps. And again, overprinting for the Centennial of India, Vasco da Gama. And again, somebody got carried away with their overprinting since you have a couple of double overprints in here. And then eventually, beginning in the 1910s, 1920s, Mozambique company issued all sorts of flashy pictorials, sort of like the old style French colonials from the 20s and the 30s. These appear to be the same value, but if you look closely, the blue is in different shades. The hatching in the sky is different. So again, I would consider these three separate stamps. Triangle stamps were issued by both the Mozambique Company and Nyasa. High quality packet material for the cheap stamp trade in the 1930s, 1940s. And again, here we have an overprint of the President of Portugal's visit to Mozambique Company, and a little problem with the E in Presidential, and that the E is partially filled in. We'll take a quick look at some postal history items from the Mozambique Company. These are more common than postal history issues from the Nyasa Company. The provinces that Mozambique Company managed in the central part of the country were more heavily populated and had more people who met various literacy requirements than the Nyasa Company. The two provinces in the far north of Mozambique were thinly populated, and so you can get a decent Mozambique Company cover in good condition like these, perhaps for around $30 to $40. It may cost you $100 or more to get a Nyasa Company cover. There just aren't that many of them. And another look here. And then finally, an airmail cover from the Mozambique Company via the Trans-Pacific Clipper that went to the US. Here we have an example of a demonetized Mozambique Company cover. Because of poor performance, much like the Nyasa Company, they weren't returning very much money to the Portuguese crown. The company's concession was not renewed, and it ended in July 1942. The company did continue to operate in the agricultural and commercial sectors until 1972, when it was taken over by another company. But here you have the 0 in a square, which means invalid stamps, and you have the T in a circle, which means postage due. And here again, you have some of an airmail, you have some of the triangular stamps, but again, the O in a square, meaning invalid issue. We'll throw in one example of a Pioneer flight. This was actually going from Germany to Inhambane in Mozambique, and with an interesting etiquette on it via airmail. A lot of airmail initial flights in other countries happened in the 1920s. For most of the Portuguese territories, they did not happen until well into the 1930s. We'll take a quick look at some cancels here. These are riverine cancels on the Zambezi River. And you can see a couple of them actually mention the Zambezi Company. The Zambezi Company had a concession, but it never issued its own stamps. It did not have extraterritoriality in terms of managing provinces. Also on the coast, you would find various maritime and seapost covers through the French and also Germans. Remember that at this time in the Classic era, what is now Tanzania was actually German East Africa, and German liners came down along Mozambique and sometimes going around the Cape of Good Hope and back up to Germany that way. And this is how Portugal got a lot of its mail out. Here's one that went through Aden, which was a British territory, eventually going to Amsterdam. Unfortunately, it ended up with postage due. And a couple of Mozambique Company stamps that went through French liners. DOAL, took me a moment of thinking on that. That stands for Deutsche Ostafrika, and whatever the German word is for line. But this was a particular shipping company. Okay, another one with elephant stamps from Mozambique company and a pictorial on it, postcard. This one did a lot of traveling, but eventually got to where it was going. And these are interesting samples of postal history. A post-World War I German issue, and some additional Kriegsmarine, which was the German Navy, Holland Africa, another line, and the pack boat, which was a generic cancel, sometimes applied to a cover, just meaning it's going by ship. We also have railroad cancels in the area of around the mouth of the Zambezi River, the city of Beira, and that may not be the correct pronunciation. There was a rail line that went into Central Africa, into the British territories of Rhodesia, and also what eventually became Northern Rhodesia. And so you would see a lot of British shipping coming out on this rail line, which was built mostly with British money, but terminated on the coast in the Mozambique Company concession. And another example of a rail line cancel. And then this one is interesting because the stamps are from Lorenzo Mark, which is now Maputo, the capital of the country in the very far southern tip of Mozambique. And at this time, there was also another rail line that ran west and southwest into South Africa, into the interior of South Africa, which was an easier way to get goods out from the area around Johannesburg going through Lorenzo Mark than necessarily going down to Port Elizabeth or Durban on the South African coast. And this particular one was on its way, it looks like, to Switzerland. We'll mention very briefly the Kianga Triangle, which was awarded to Germany from Germany to Mozambique and Portugal after World War I. This was a small contested area at the very northern tip of Mozambique. Issued 4 of its own stamps, and then also you can find other stamps of roughly the same period with a Kianga cancel. Okay, from here we'll run through a number of various postal history items from World War I that came out through territories of Mozambique. Some of these are also prisoner of war correspondence that came from interned German soldiers. An interesting historical note is of the 10 German colonies at the start of World War I in 1914, the only colony where the German army was still in the field on Armistice Day in 1918 was in German East Africa, which became Tanganyika. And here we have one with a censor mark. And again, additional censor marks and prisoner of war going to Lisbon and then being forwarded on to Bavaria. Another one, this actually, not sure why this would have a Southern Rhodesia stamp on it, but again, it came out of Mozambique and an interned German POW. And this is an interesting one. It passed the censor in Kaliman and was sent on eventually to Europe. It used 4 stamps from Kaliman, but also 2 war tax stamps on the right from Mozambique itself. And this is a postcard going to Germany from within the Mozambique Company area. An exempt letter going to someone in the US with a prisoner of war label on it. And this one is an interesting one. This went from the Mozambique Company territory, prisoner of war postal card to Hamburg, but it also went through the Red Cross, International Red Cross in Geneva. And another one with a censor marking on it. It went to London. Dr. Cross wasn't sure about this one, but he included it anyway. He thought it may have come from the Mozambique Company area, but it was on its way to England. And this is one from the Nyasa Company with Nyasa stamps on, but a Nyasaland postmark. And so this is one that needs a little more research. I'm only vaguely familiar with it. Nyasaland was formerly British Central Africa and is now Malawi. And so, but it's interesting cancels with interesting varieties. Okay, that will conclude our presentation on Portuguese East Africa. We'll leave this slide up for just a moment, giving you some background of Dr. John Cross from Oakhurst, California. He's a longtime editor of Portu Info, the quarterly journal of the International Society for Portuguese Philately. He has been an exhibitor and a prolific author. We list two of his books that are in the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library available for loan. He's also a member of the Club Filatelico in Portugal. At the time, in 2022, was a member of the American Philatelic Society. Dr. Cross has a doctorate degree in biology from the University of Arizona and taught for over 2 decades in the local school system. As a sideline, John is an avid birder and a longtime member of the Yosemite Audubon Society. And then we'll wrap it up with our video production team for the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library. They've been involved with production of videos that are available on the library's YouTube site, and then just yours truly providing the script and narration for this particular video.